So over the break, I read Other Minds by Peter Godfrey-Smith, subtitled The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness, which was a really interesting book about the title subjects like cephalopods and the mind and language and social intelligence and a bunch of other things. So I read this book and had a discussion about it with my friend Christian. Christian has taken a neuroscience class with me in high school, so he knows the basics of the field, but one of his main hobbies is reading philosophy. So he's read a bit about the philosophy of the mind and consciousness and language, so I thought he'd be a fun perspective to kind of discuss the subject with. So this is a bit of a long project, but I hope the conversation is enlightening.
I thought something that was really cool was like the whole idea of like how a nervous system develops, because like there's that whole like important part about how the internalization of signaling, so like bacteria signal to each other and like just the concentration of things in the environment, they like sense things in the environment and then they respond to that. But then that is kind of what a nervous system does, but for multicellular organisms that needed to be internalized and like take signaling to like external organisms and do it within an organism between different types of cells. I liked how he started with like that like very base thing of like what a nervous system is, and it's like signaling.
Yeah, and especially how he used that to sort of lead into his discussion about how the octopus nervous system is different from the human nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, but it's cool that like the last common ancestor or whatever of us and the octopus is the last common ancestor between vertebrates and invertebrates, and that thing is just like a worm and it's like it's so basic and like barely has a nervous system. And I found it really cool about we have like such complex nervous systems, and according to this book and something I agree with, cephalopods also do, and that arose like independently in two different evolutionary branches is like really cool to me. So one of the other things about like why or how the nervous system developed is this whole like distinction between the sensory motor view and like the action shaping view. So like the sensory motor view is something happens and you sense it and then you do a motor response to it, and that's like one reason why you would need a nervous system. And the other view is action shaping, in that in order to like do a movement fluidly and properly, you need a nervous system to coordinate like all of the muscles and make everything happen in a sequence. And so like those are two reasons why you would need a nervous system. And then I liked how he talked about how these are kind of conflicting views, but he likes the idea that an early nervous system could be something that was just action shaping, and then it kind of transitioned into something that did both. He talked about the Cambrian Explosion as being like the moment when the process where like a lot of things changed, one of which being you get eye spots and like sensory stalks and like all of that stuff and like a bilateral body plan. So life gets more complex, you get more complex sensation, which would make sense that then you would get a more complex nervous system because you have more information coming in.
Yeah, no, for sure. Another thing that I found interesting in the book regarding sort of like the evolution of nervous systems is I was just reading like the last little bits of the book, and he was talking about how this, right, we think that most cephalopods like squid, cuttlefish, octopi are fairly intelligent creatures compared to most other
like snails.
Snails and other non-human animals.
Yeah.
And he talks about how it used to be that we thought that this sort of like explosion in intelligence occurred once in sort of like the cephalopod line. But now like the evidence sort of suggests that process actually didn't happen once, but actually happened twice. Which I found like pretty interesting, that, you know, we could have sort of like this explosion in, you know, an alternative intelligence more than one time in the evolutionary tree, and doesn't even have any sort of relationship with, you know, the evolutionary processes going on with vertebrate species like ourselves. So I found that to be pretty interesting, you know, how the breakdown between octopods and what do you call them, decapods?
Yeah.
The 10-footed and the 8-footed.
Right. So like in cephalopods, the main three that he talks about are octopuses, squids, and cuttlefish. Squids and cuttlefish are like kind of lumped together, and then octopuses are like their own thing because we have more information about them and they're like more studied and everything. And I found that interesting too, because the split between the octopods and the decapods happened pretty long ago in the past.
I think the book said like 270 million years.
Right. They thought it happened 170 million years ago, but then they like did more analysis and it was actually 270 million years ago. But that split happened really early, much earlier than we would think a super complex nervous system developed, which means that it arose, like a complicated nervous system arose individually in the octopods and in the decapods. So that's like already like 3 different separate emergences of a complicated nervous system. And then you consider like even in the vertebrate branch, because like cephalopods are invertebrates, in the vertebrate branch with us, we have like mammals and stuff that have similar nervous systems to us, but we also have birds. Like you mentioned birds a couple of times, and like that is also like a separate branch. If you wanted to think about it this way, you could think of like 4 different types of intelligence across the animal kingdom. So something he talks about in the earlier chapters is like the whole loss of the shell. So you have your vertebrate ancestor, this like Ediacaran, I think is the era before the Cambrian. Ediacaran, okay, cool. Yeah. You have this Ediacaran like worm thing that's like crawling along on the ocean floor and that has like a shell, and then it somehow gets jettisoned into the water, and then you have this like swimming thing with a shell, and then because like mollusks have shells, right? So what happens with the cephalopods is that they lose their shell. So like for the octopus, they like completely lose it. The cuttlefish like internalizes it, and then the squid has some kind of weird shell, like small structure or something. But the interesting part is that they lose this protective shell. And then what happens is, this is something I thought was really interesting with the nervous system, is that it gives them more like motility and like makes them like this like blob thing. And then you like really need like a strongly coordinated nervous system to like actually control what's going on in the body. Yeah. So that is like one of the questions he poses, like why do octopuses have this like complicated nervous system? Why is it so big? Why is it so complex? And one of them is because they need to be able to action coordinate, if you will, and like control all of their limbs and stuff. And that stems from this like loss of the shell. And then also like later on, when the book goes into all of these stories about octopuses like in the lab being all like inquisitive and curious and like manipulating objects, he also like links that to this like initial loss of the shell and how that makes them more like mobile and manipulating the environment. And that could be a reason why, with an already pretty large nervous system that like is used for manipulating the environment, it like kind of makes, there's like a logical thread there with them developing like an inquisitive nature or something.
Yeah. And I think another good point to emphasize is sort of like the differences between the cephalopod nervous system and, you know, sort of like the human nervous system, right? Because at least the sense that I got from the book was that the cephalopod nervous system is far more decentralized than the human nervous system.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the cephalopods, mainly they study this in the octopus, they just have more data on the octopus, is that most of their neurons are like in their arms, not necessarily in their brain, which makes sense for this like action shaping view, because like you need all of the neurons in the arms to like control them fluidly. They have like an overall sense of control by the brain though. I think they did like an experiment where they like had an octopus stick one of its arms in a maze, but like it was like a see-through maze, so they could see where the exit was. So once the octopus like got good at navigating its arm through the maze, its arm would go in the general correct direction, but like it would wiggle and like try and like explore a little in that area. And the way they interpret it is that the brain like overall controls the direction, but like the specifics are controlled by the arms themselves, which is like kind of weird to consider.
Yeah, he does have like these anecdotes of sort of like arms acting independently on octopi, and like for example, one arm might be probing him or one of his teammates, and then the other arms are occupied with some other sort of activity. So I found like that pretty cool, that sort of like decentralized nature, and the fact that it's not like you have like 8 different consciousnesses, right? In the arms, but you have almost like 8 different directors, and all
Right.
their movements are coming together to form one symphony of action.
Right. Well, that was an interesting thing in like one of the later chapters. He talked a lot about like the concept of like self versus other, and how like we have a pretty strong sense of like self versus like us versus other things, and like other things in the environment. And he talks about how like cephalopods, they have shown that they have like the idea of like perceptual constancy. So like if they see an object but they like see it from a different angle, they can still recognize it as the same object. So they have like this sense that like objects exist in the environment. And then also that there were all these anecdotes of researchers who would like try and interact with an octopus, but they would just completely ignore the researcher, just like not even care that they were there. So like they have this concept of like paying attention to things in the environment. So the way this ties back into the arms is that if you're an organism with like a complicated nervous system and you can like manipulate objects and then see that you've manipulated an object, I think the author was like trying to connect that to the idea of like you have a sense of self, you have a sense of the other or the environment, and you're like manipulating the environment, and you are the one doing that. But with an octopus, it's kind of different because like the centralized brain is not in full control of the arms. So the arms are somewhat doing their own thing. So the question he asks is like, does the octopus have like a sense of self that is like fuzzy because like the arms are part self and part other or something? And that's something that's really interesting to me because it's like, from what I've been told, like it's kind of like being drunk in the sense that like you kind of send your arm out and hope that it's gonna go in the right direction, and it either does or doesn't. But like for an octopus, because they have such a complicated nervous system in their arms, it like always works because we don't have like a decentralized nervous system. So that is like something that could be related. But then also he talks about how like in humans we also have things where like if you're playing a video game that you really know, or you're playing an instrument, like you kind of just do it. You don't need to like think about it. It kind of just happens.
Yeah, they're like fine motor movements that happen sort of unconsciously.
Right.
Pretty interesting.
Right. And like maybe for an octopus, that's just like the extended version of that, where like most of the things that they do are just like not super like controlled or like aware. They just kind of happen, which would like in a sense of like what is their subjective experience of that, like that's interesting because like he references Nagel at some point in this book.
There's an entire chapter devoted to the question of subjective experience,
right
which Nagel is the focus of what is it like to be a bat.
Right.
He tries to make like he's not talking about consciousness. That's the key thing here.
Right. That was something I found interesting because he like drew a clear distinction, and he said that consciousness is different from subjective experience. But then when he was like going into it more, he used them interchangeably sometimes. And every time in my notes, I was like, are you talking about consciousness or are you talking about subjective experience? I think what he said was that you don't have to have consciousness to have subjective experience of something. Like you can be sentient of things and experience them without having what we consider consciousness, which is like kind of hard to think about.
Yeah.
But like I found that whole section really interesting because like the idea of consciousness is like the most interesting part of this field to me. It's also like the hardest part to study. So that's great.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he talks about subjective experience first. And how like there was that one patient DF who like doesn't have the subjective experience of sight, but like is able to stick letters through like mailbox slots at different angles. Like fine, she can do that fine, but she doesn't have the experience of sight. And they like to the study that he referenced said that she had damage to her ventral stream of processing in the visual pathway. So that's like the what pathway. And the dorsal stream, which is like more for like real-time navigation and like coordinating like movement with sensory stuff, like that was like not damaged, but she didn't have the subjective experience of sight. So they're trying to link the subjective experience of sight to the ventral stream. And he uses that to lead into this theory by Milner and Goodale, where he talks about how all of the activity in our brain that leads to a subjective experience, so like the ventral stream or whatever, is trying to build a coherent model of the world. Because like for us, our subjective experience is like integrated and coherent, and it's like we're experiencing one experience from all of our senses. And the idea that I really like is that this building of a coherent inner model, that is our subjective experience. And without the building of a coherent inner model, there is no subjective experience. That one's a little bit of a leap, but like I really like that idea where he references like the study they did. Well, he references two things. He references birds and how their visual fields are like separate.
Their left and their right visual fields don't really coordinate with each other.
So like they don't really have like an integrated sense of it integrated information. So like how can they have like an integrated experience? And then also with frogs, he talked about how you can rewire parts of their visual system so they like snap at prey to the left when the prey is actually at its right, and like vice versa, so it snaps in the wrong direction, but no other visual processing is changed. Like they can still navigate and they can still move around objects and stuff. It's just like they will see reversed images of prey. I mean, like I know Nagel would say that we can't know this, but like how would it feel to like see as a frog in that instance? Like do they like, you can't have a cohesive experience if like you can just change this like one thing and then it's like everything else in your vision is fine, but you see a prey in the wrong area. Like it doesn't make sense. So he uses that to say that frogs don't have coherent visual perception, a coherent integrated experience. So like there is no point to asking what is the subjective experience of seeing as a frog like, because they don't have this integrated experience. I thought that was a bit of a leap, but that was a really interesting leap for me to think about. Yeah, so they would say that like it doesn't feel like anything to look through the eyes of a frog, because like they don't have the internal machinery to build a coherent model, so that they don't have a subjective experience, which is really wild to think of.
Well, is he saying that, well, wait, before we say that he doesn't have like a subjective experience, like don't you think that we should define like what it means to have subjective experience, right?
I think so. This is the Milner and Goodale model that he talks about, is that this is like one model where having an integrated model, like the building of the integrated model in your brain, that is what gives us subjective experience. So that the model is saying that our subjective experience is dependent on having a coherent inner model of the world.
Which is something which is a like debatable idea, right?
Right. I mean, we know for us at least, we have a coherent inner model of the world, and that is dependent upon stuff like, so like with the ventral stream example, like the ventral stream in the brain, that activity contributes to our inner model, and a loss of that activity makes us unable to subjectively experience sight. Even if we can like move around and do things, we don't have the subjective experience of sight because that part is deleted or like broken in our coherent model. So that's like one theory he presents. One of the things I like in this book is that he doesn't like say a lot of like, this is the truth. He's just like, here are some theories and here's how I connect them to other things. And I appreciate that. But that was like one theory I found interesting, is that the subjective experience is dependent on a coherent inner model.
Well, he eventually uses all these ideas to lead into, these different versions of the global workspace theory, right?
Right. Right. There's like, he wanted to talk about a gradual development of consciousness, not just like consciousness appeared at some point. And he wanted to talk about, so he had like two views. He had like the latecomer view, which is that this is mainly on consciousness, less on subjective experience, is the idea that, so a lot of people in this field, according to him, say that you need like a global workspace for consciousness, like the consciousness is tied centrally to Barr's idea of global workspace theory, so that like we're conscious of information that has been like brought into a centralized workspace, or like the spotlight has been shown on like certain processes in the brain, and that is what we are conscious of. And then there was also the idea he brought up of like working memory being necessary, and that consciousness is tied to whatever is currently in our working memory. Like we're conscious of what our brain is using to moment to moment solve problems in our working memory. So the latecomer view is basically, if you need those things for consciousness, it kind of ends up meaning that you have to think that consciousness is a very, very late development, because very few animals have like the complexity or like biological machinery to have anything like that, as far as we know. So in that theory, consciousness would only develop very late in evolutionary history. The author really likes this transformational view, in that there was a subjective form of experience that wasn't consciousness that existed before any global workspace or anything happened. And he ties this to things like pain and thirst and hunger and like primordial experiences that he claims that you don't really need to be conscious and don't need to have a complicated nervous system to have. So he looks at like animals which have wound guarding behaviors and that will like tend to their wounds when they get hurt. And also he did an example with like hermit crabs or some other like animal where they would make a decision to avoid something painful, but if they were getting a reward of something else, they would like be willing to deal with the pain in order to get that reward. But he showed that there are these animals that can make like decisions and like choices to avoid pain. So he had this idea that like these animals are having a subjective experience of pain, and that is still a subjective experience. And I find that compelling. Like it's not like consciousness in the sense where like, I mean, it could be, I mean, it depends on what you think of consciousness, but like, it's definitely a subjective experience I think they're having. And so I think his like gradualism model that he talks about is that you have these like primordial experiences like pain and hunger and whatever, but then as the nervous system gets more complex, I guess in the Cambrian explosion, like with more sensory stuff, but also more motor stuff, you can have a more complicated subjective experience. And then later when the centralized nervous system gets like way more complex in like mammals and you get what looks like a global workspace or whatever, then you get something that is more in line with what we think of as consciousness. But there was this form of subjective experience, he would say, that happened early on that gradually transitioned into consciousness, which is like different because like usually when you're studying consciousness, it's like consciousness is like an all or nothing thing, and like no one talks about like a gradual thing. So I found that cool.
So I forget if he actually answers this question, but where does Peter Godfrey-Smith place octopi like in sort of like this spectrum, right? I forget if he thinks that like they meet the threshold, or if he actually even says that they meet the threshold of having a global workspace. Because, in some ways, it almost seems as if, like, octopi and other cephalopods, like, they almost seem to occupy, like, an intermediate space between, the highly integrated and highly centralized human nervous system, and then, sort of like the more decentralized nervous systems of more basic organisms.
Right.
So I forget if he actually answers that question, but I think it's something that's kind of interesting to sort of speculate about.
Right, yeah. I also am not fully sure if he answers it or he kind of just like hints at it. There are definitely like studies of, I think he mentioned, of octopuses having something kind of like working memory, in the sense that they can remember where food is hidden and like know that like certain food is like gonna go bad, quote unquote. These are like experiments done in like labs where they like hide food and like rotate it out at certain times, and they know which one to go to get their favorite food in time before it like gets rotated out, and that requires like some form of like working memory. I don't remember if he says that there's some form of like global workspace or like complicated consciousness in octopi or octopuses, whatever. That like always trips me up because it's easier to say octopi, but everyone says
better to say octopi.
I like it. Anyway, it's not important.
Yeah, that's very true.
Right.
Language is dependent on use,
Language, see, he has that whole section, speaking of language, he has that whole section about like inner speech. That like was really cool, but it took me a while to like understand what he was saying about inner speech. He mentions Hume and like Vygotsky, and like I've heard of Hume, I hadn't heard of Vygotsky.
I've heard of Vygotsky, maybe like once or twice. Never internalized what he meant.
But I see what you did there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I I did find like that concept of inner speech like really, really interesting.
Mhm.
And I felt like it sort of related to something else that I had read called The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker,
Yeah.
which is an older book by him. I wouldn't recommend reading very many of the newer books,
Mhm.
but you know, like one of these older books are definitely very cool. And you know, as the book said, Vygotsky was a Marxist. Steven Pinker is most certainly not a Marxist, but like I found a similarity in the ideas is that in the language instinct, what he's trying to do is he's basically he's applying arguments for Chomsky's universal grammar, right?
Mhm.
Which is the idea that like all humans have an innate sense of grammar
Language.
and that all
Yeah.
languages can be reduced to universal grammar.
Yeah.
And what Chomsky doesn't believe that the emergence of that universal grammar is due to evolution,
Mhm.
and Steven Pinker does. And one of the earlier points in the book that he was talking about is that humans, like in our mind, we communicate with ourselves with he calls it mentalese,
Mhm.
um, which to me sounds pretty similar to
Inner
Vygotski's
speech.
notion of inner speech, right?
Right.
Because the inner speech, or the mentalese, as Pinker would call it, is different from the actual language that we use to communicate with other humans, right?
Right.
Right. So like where Pinker talks a lot about, you know, like translating things from mentalese to, you know, human speech, Vygotsky talks about, you know, that inner speech, and then how that I forget if he has a term for it, but you know, but how we communicate that inner speech to other people.
Right. That's like Vygotsky's idea, which is talked about in this book, is that inner speech. So like the concept of like a running mental like commentary or just like thoughts that you think kind of in terms of speech in your head. Vygotsky's idea is that it started, so like external speech first is a thing in like development as children develop, and then that gets internalized into like an inner form of speech, which is what leads to complex thought, which is like a bit of a strong claim, and it's something that this book also mentioned Darwin, that Darwin claimed that inner or outer speech is required for complex thought, which is like very strong Sapir-Whorf vibes is what that gives me.
Yeah. So in Pinker, it's like almost the complete opposite. Mentalese comes first before human speech. And where the Vygotsky view seems to imply the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which just for people who don't know, the idea that languages, like different languages, have pretty significant impacts on, you know, cognition, right? Would you agree with that definition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That like language affects, like the strongest version is that language required for and like basically what causes thought, and like the weaker versions are like language influences thought, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And Pinker poo-poos on that entire idea.
Yeah.
He's extremely dismissive of this idea, because for him, mentalese is independent of actual human speech.
Right.
So like the path of causation is different from Vygotsky.
Right. I think another thing that like kind of goes against that idea is in this book he mentions baboons and how they have a very like limited quote unquote vocabulary of like series of like growls and like hoots and whatever, but there are like certain there's like this whole thing where like if two male baboons are interacting and like one of them hoots or growls before the other one does the other thing, the other ones in the area can tell who in the hierarchy has been challenged and who in the hierarchy has been defeated, and like they keep up this complicated social hierarchy only through a limited number of like hoots and growls. So you could argue that there is complex thought going on, like thought about like who is in charge of the social order or like who has been like ousted or whatever, but there's not a lot of language going on. It's just like a series of hoots and growls. So that's one thing that this book talks about, is like a counter to the idea that like language is necessary for thought. But also like birds, like even outside of mammalians, like birds like crows and jays can distinctly remember where food is stored, when is stored, and stuff like that, but without any real concept of like language. So like I think the author of this book falls in like a somewhat middle ground where like language provides like language is like helpful for the structuring of thought, but it's not like required for it. I think one of the interesting things is like He brings back the ideas of efference copies.
So just to provide more background on efference copies, there's the idea that obviously your sensations affect your actions. That's as old as bacteria sensing concentration gradients and moving towards them. However, there's also like a converse where your actions can affect your sensations. So the example in the book is that they use electric fish and they can sense the electrical fields around them, but they also give off an electric field. So it begs the question, how do they distinguish between their own electric field and the environment? So what they do is they send out a copy of their electric field to their sensory systems, and that allows them to cancel it out. And that copy is what we mean when we say an efference copy. There are a lot of examples of animals in the animal kingdom doing this, like sending out a copy of their own actions in order to affect their sensation. But an efference copy is something really interesting that this book brings up.
He brings back the ideas of efference copies, but he brings this up with inner speech in the idea of like, if we're assuming that like outer speech or just like speech happened first, and then inner speech is like an internalization of that, it's kind of like an efference copy in the sense that you're creating an efference copy of the speech you are giving in the outside world, and you can use that efference copy, quote, like use it to like structure your thought and like organize your ideas, and like maybe this is how inner speech like evolutionarily developed, is the idea that is presented in the book, is that there was external speech, or just like maybe not like speech or like language, but just like external,
it's some form of external communication or
some form of external communication, and then you get an efference copy of that in a sense with like internal communication, and that can evolve as the nervous system evolves into helping structure thought. That was something I found pretty interesting. But like even more interesting is like this connection to the global workspace from before, is the idea that like, so when you are inner speeching, quote unquote, that's what I said in my notes, like when you have inner speech, it kind of feels like you're hearing something from the, not like you're hearing something from the outside world, but like you're able to like analyze your thoughts in like an external sense from your own thoughts. Like you're not, it's hard to explain, but the idea of like inner speech is like broadcasting information in your brain. So like if there's information in like a part of your brain, or like your brain has information that it wants the rest of your brain to know, inner speech is a method for like quote unquote vocalizing that and broadcasting that information. So the idea, where this is another idea, is that like consciousness or like thought in a sense is when you have like a global workspace and you're focusing on ideas, and then through inner speech that's broadcasted to the rest of your brain. It like once he starts connecting all of these, it kind of feels like he's like pulling together different words and being like, you know, like subjective experience and consciousness is the broadcasting of inner global workspace, and you're like, okay, slow down. It's like kind of hard to fit everything together when he talks about it like that. But I do like the idea of inner speech being tied to like conscious thought, in the sense that it's broadcasting information in your brain to your own brain in like an efference copy sense, so that you can structure your own thought. And like I know like if I'm thinking about something and I am like thinking about it and I have like an inner monologue going on, that's much easier to like unpack and like figure out what's going on and like structure my thought than like just like ambient things, you know? And he does talk about how this is like this is like a theory that he has, where like inner speech being like an efference copy, and it being used to broadcast information in the brain. Like there is no like evidence for any of that, but it's like a theory that he has.
Okay.
Like it makes sense.
So let me ask.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Let me ask. Just for clarification, the efference copy in question is of other humans' language, right? So does that mean that like this sort of inner speech is necessarily composed of words?
I think well, the way Vygotsky says, yeah, that it's an internalization of already external speech. I guess in an efference copy sense that Godfrey-Smith says it, it's like if you're speaking or communicating, he posits that the brain makes an efference copy of that speech for yourself, which is interesting to consider. Like, he posits that that's how inner speech started. Like, that's how inner speech started evolutionarily. But sometimes you're not speaking to anyone, you're just having inner speech. Like, you're just thinking thoughts in your brain. He posits that it started as an efference copy, and then as the nervous system got more complex, it developed into this thing that is used by the brain to broadcast thoughts and have all of the brain have access to those thoughts, quote unquote, to organize them and analyze them. So if I'm understanding him correctly, it started as more of an efference copy, and then evolved into something that is used to structure thought, I think is what he's saying.
And the reason why I asked, are these efference copies composed of, language, as in words, and but just to clarify that Vygotsky is talking primarily about words, is because I know that in my own subjective experience, the stuff of thought, or mentally, as Pinker would say, it isn't always composed of words. Sometimes it's composed of an image,
like Hume would say,
or something that's non-lingual.
Right. I think Hume would say perceptions or impressions of ideas, right? That just pass one into another. This is something I thought of that was kind of interesting, is that I think Vygotsky and others kind of assume that you need language for this inner speech thing to happen, but honestly I think it's something I think you can train, and I think in a sense you can train yourself to put language to your impressions and your thoughts that aren't dependent on language. I think that's a lot of what cognitive behavioral therapy is, and I think some people are better at it than others because they've trained to put words and language to their thoughts. Because if you're having impressions or just images, and you in my subjective experience, if you try and put those into language in your head, it makes them easier to understand, and it makes them more coherent, I guess, in a way, and you are able to analyze them better, which is, I think, what Godfrey-Smith is saying is the purpose of inner speech, is it helps you organize and broadcast your thoughts, I guess. So I guess maybe you can have I guess the takeaway is that you can have thoughts, and you can have subjective experience, but when you start using inner speech, or you start having putting language to those thoughts, it becomes more complex, it becomes more organized, and I would say evolutionarily that would give you an advantage, I guess, socially or just in the environment, and that is what passes that on to more to have more complex inner speech later on. But I think it's worthwhile to say that you don't need words and language to have thought. I think that's worthwhile, but I think it's also worthwhile to say that having that words and language is an advantage, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think in part I agree with you. I just think that I sometimes wonder, if there might be some sort of heterogeneity, and just how, Homo sapiens, organize their thoughts, right? Because if we take Hume at his word, and if he thinks that, perception and this sort of thread of consciousness isn't really structured by language at all. It's just a series of impressions and sensations. Hume was a pretty smart guy, and I wouldn't be one to say that he wasn't able to structure his thoughts. Obviously his ideas are communicated in language,
right?
But I'm not sure if when he's organizing those ideas in his mind, that he's organizing them with language in his mind, and then using them to and then using that structure to communicate it to the outside world. So right. I mean, all this is completely speculative, but right. Sometimes I'm just wondering if this emphasis on words and language is really necessary to sort of explain the organization of thoughts within the mind.
Right. Well, in the book he mentioned the study of the guy who had a stroke and or would have strokes, and in those strokes he wouldn't have any inner monologue or inner speech, quote unquote, but he was still able to like do things and like interact with people like by like gesturing to things, and like he could accomplish tasks and stuff, and he like could, for the period of time where like his inner speech, quote unquote, was gone, he could still like function and he was still a person. So like it's not like it's completely necessary. I think he's looking at it from like an evolutionary perspective, in the sense that like why would we have evolved inner speech? Probably I think what he's saying is that because it is useful for structuring thought, and that makes it more advantageous for so like he messes around with evolution every now and then, where he says like something evolved because it was advantageous, or like something evolved to fulfill a place, which is something I'm always careful about, because like evolution didn't like things don't evolve in order to do something. Things evolve because they're beneficial in the environment. So like every time he says that, I try and like check myself in my brain to say like, okay, maybe like inner speech evolved, quote unquote, in the sense that it inner speech, if you had like language to structure your thought in a sense, or if you had more structured thought in that way, it would give you an evolutionary advantage over your compatriots that didn't, and that would allow you to like survive longer and reproduce and whatever. And that's how inner speech could have evolved as something that like is selected for, in a sense, I think is what he's saying. I think there could be heterogeneity of human experience, but I think maybe that is like hard to like that goes back to like the whole Nagel thing, because like we can't really know.
Yeah. I mean, and we'll live with humans. With humans, we can sort of self-report, but even then,
Right.
like self-reported data, you know, is always going to be sketchy, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think this idea that, you know, like, you know, having some sort of inner speech to like basically you know, organize thought. I think, I mean, it makes sense, right? That like that would be advantageous to be able to do that. And but just to be clear, this is an idea that only humans have constructed, right? Or is he saying that this also applies to the baboon example? It applies to like the Sataning example of octopi, which he also discusses further in the book.
Right. Well, I think baboons, that was like a counter example to the idea, because like they don't have very complicated external speech. So like would they have, if internal speech is an internalization of external speech, then like you would assume that baboons don't really have inner speech, but they have complex thought and like memory and stuff. So that's like a counterexample. I think with octopuses, the interesting part comes with their whole like they are not very social, like at all. In the wild, octopuses are not very social, which is really interesting. Except for Octopus. Octopus is wild, man. I want to go to Octopus. But like in a non-Octopus sense, they're not very social, which is wild considering the whole like section about their colored patterning. And they have like these beautiful complex patterns, and like they're like super like expressive, and like there was like that one octopus named Matisse who would just like burst into like yellow like randomly, and like yellow they thought was like an alarm color, but like he would just do it for fun. And these guys have like such complicated expressions, but one, they're not very social, like they don't interact with each other a lot except for like mating and like every now and then like when they get into fights. And two, they have one photoreceptor, so like they can't even see each other's colors. So there's like no reason for the color expression to be that complex and that lively. It just is like that. So I found that like really interesting. That was like the one part where I was like, whoa, hold on. And they like have multiple reasons why this could have been the case. So the first one is camouflage, which makes a lot of sense if you consider the whole like when they lost their shells, they got like less protected.
Gotta protect yourself somehow.
Right. They like had to be more protected. And then also like, so all of their color system is like wired up to their nervous system. It's controlled by their nervous system. So like if you already had a complicated nervous system because you needed to be able to like action coordinate and control your now loose blobby body, and you need camouflage and you need to be camouflage, like it makes sense that you would get like a very complicated patterning system. Also, there's the idea of like mating displays and like how like the color system helps with mating displays, and then also what they call dematic displays, like which are just like to confuse and ward off predators. Like if like they octopi are predators, but they're also predated upon. So like if like a fish comes to attack it and then it just like starts shooting off wild colors, then like that's like a warding off kind of thing. But my favorite idea is that this like patterning and like color expression, because like they've like done studies where they just watch octopuses and cuttlefish and they just like will randomly cycle through colors and patterns just for apparently no reason. And they'll be like pretty complex patterns too. Like they have like a cloud display, like some kind of screensaver. It's wild. But like my favorite reason for this is it's because it's this idea of like an innate chatter in the nervous system where like because their color expression is like wired up to their nervous system, they have this like internal activity constantly going on in the nervous system like anyone does, just like noise and like a nervous system just functioning. And these colorful displays are just like a reflection of that chatter, which I find really interesting because like there's no super social reason why they would need to be communicating this much to each other, but it makes sense if it's just like a byproduct of a really complex nervous system that's also wired to an expression system. Yeah. We watched a video about Chomsky for this class, and he talked about the language acquisition device and everything. And he was asked like, doesn't means like our we're less influenced by the environment than by like a innate thing. That was a question he was asked in this interview, and he like kind of disagreed with that, but he said that if our expression of language, if our language was only influenced like in a behaviorism sense, like by what we got from the environment, then like through conditioning and everything, then like our expression would only be a direct reflection of what's in our environment because we're only like influenced by the environment. So what we express is only going to be a reflection of our environment. It's not going to be dependent on anything else. And that reminded me of this whole octopus thing where like their expression in a color sense is only dependent on like their nervous system environment. They don't have like this internal communication thing that is being used to like express anything except in the sense of like maybe mating and stuff like that.
Yeah, or like fear or something like that.
Right. And I really like this idea of like a social dynamic being really important to like a complex nervous system, because like going to Octopus, which is a wild example. So just to describe Octopus, so it's like a bed of seashells with like rocks and like piles of stuff in it, where octopuses have kind of like colonized it and like made it like, I don't want to say it's like a society, but it feels like a society. It like, so there's like a central big like den where like an octopus lives, and then there's like dens scattered all around, and like the one in the middle is the one that like fights with everyone and like kind of is quote unquote like in charge. Like it's the one that like wins the most fights. Yeah, it's the most dominant one. And like, you know, they don't do this in the wild. They have like dens and stuff, but they're all super like distant from each other. They don't interact with each other, but these guys will like wander around this area and like go around to each other and like fight each other. Or like there are these stories of like these octopuses that like it will like go to another one's den, and then it will like stick its tentacle and then just like see what the other octopus is, because like they have all their sensory information in their tentacles, and like either they will like flash like a non-aggression color and then like leave each other alone, or they will like flash an aggression color and like start fighting. And it's like a really like interesting like social experiment, because like these guys aren't social normally, but they are. And then also like in a lab sense, octopuses can like recognize experimenters, and they'll have like experimenters. Like there was that one story of the one octopus who hated this like one particular lady, and like whenever she walked past, he would like squirt water at her. And like that's not even like recognizing someone by like touch, by like their touch receptors, but they're just like able to recognize people. And it's like, why? There's no like, they're not social in their environment, so like why are they social when they're put in like a weird octopus environment that just happened by chance or by in a lab? Why do they have these social cues? And I think it's interesting that like for them, and then for any other like intelligent animal, I would say like dolphins, baboons, outside of mammals, even like birds, most of those are like pretty social. And I think Peter Godfrey-Smith says at one point, like a social interaction and needing that social interaction is like something that is kind of key for developing a complex nervous system, because in a sense you do something and like you do an action and then it's perceived by others or like perceived by the social order of your system, and then consequences happen and then you perceive those consequences, and it's like another like it's another loop in a sense where you're acting and then perceiving and then acting and perceiving. But like if you're acting in relation to other organisms, it becomes like more complex and you can have like a social order. And I don't know, I just thought that was interesting, the link between like having a social system and like having complicated intelligence. I thought that was a really interesting thing.
Yeah, especially since like studiers of biological anthropology with humans, like usually point to the fact that it's usually the most social proto-humans are the ones that we're like most likely to be descended from, right? That like social interaction between these proto-humans is like one of the key factors in sort of like their explosion past other primates.
Right. That's really interesting. And like also to like go back to like the Ediacaran era or whatever, is like before then, something he denotes is that era, the Ediacaran era, was very socially isolated. There was not a lot of interaction between organisms, like not even in like a camaraderie or like whatever sense, in like predation or like anything like that. That didn't really exist. You gotta wait for the Cambrian explosion to see claws or like grabbing implements or like things that denote social interaction or predation or competition with other organisms. And like that coincides with this like more complex nervous system developing. So it's like the actions of other organisms are finally influencing your perception, because now we have eye spots and perception apparatuses. So you're having a feedback between other organisms and the self organism. So you're having the social interaction combined with a complicated nervous system. So that is like something that is like really key, in the sense that I think he said something that like the mind evolved as a response to other minds, which is like good reference to the title. But like it's an interesting thought that like the interaction with other organisms is something that is like key to the development of like intelligence, quote unquote. I thought that was interesting.
So
yeah I mean, this was a really interesting book. A lot of it was evolutionary, but I think that's an important like perspective to be like, why did this develop, and like how could it have been useful, and then how could it have been shaped or changed into what it is now. And I think that's not really considered, like it is considered a little, but it's not considered a ton in a lot of cognitive neuroscience, I would say.
Really?
I mean, I don't know, maybe
perspective?
I mean, maybe it is. Maybe I'm just not like well read up enough on it. But I feel like, at least in my class and a lot of classes I've taken, it's just like it's like, hey, here's like an evolutionary perspective, and it's like here, and it's like, let's just talk about the evolutionary side. Now let's go back to like our main point. But I think it's interesting to have like the main point be like, how did things like evolutionarily develop? Like, how did consciousness go from like a white noise sense where like there's like not a lot happening, to like the primordial pain and like other stuff like as a subjective experience, and then it transitioned into something that's more complicated with like maybe inner speech or just like a global workspace. Like that development is really interesting to me, and I really like appreciated that. And I also appreciated like looking at the octopus, because like as he said, like it is evolutionarily very distinct from anything we normally consider intelligent. But I think you would be hard pressed to like say that it doesn't have some form of intelligence. Just looking at like, first of all, Octopus, like what? And like second of all, like lab studies where like they have them like interacting with researchers and stuff like that. You would be hard pressed to say that octopi just like aren't like curious and like playful and like inquisitive. Like that's something he uses a lot, is that they're inquisitive and they're like trying to like figure stuff out with like their food or like toys that people have or like things that fall into the ocean. They like play with them. And it would be hard to say that they aren't in some sense intelligent, but they're like so different from us. It's like looking at where that difference is and like how it developed. I think that's really valuable.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was really my main conversation with Christian, we did talk a little bit about embodied cognition and the couple of references to that in the book, but it didn't really fit in anywhere with the main flow of the conversation, so I have it just at the end here. But overall, we both really enjoyed this book and thought it was a good exploration of kind of the evolution of consciousness in both the human line and in the invertebrate line with the octopuses. So yeah, that's it.
Oh, he like mentioned embodied cognition like once or twice.
Yeah.
He seemed to have a problem with it, but I feel like I didn't really understand his problem with it. So his main problems with it were that when he talks about embodied cognition, he talks about the idea of like the environment being stored in the body as like relationships between joints or like whatever. And he says that octopuses don't have that because they're just blobs. And then he also, the other thing that he talks about more is that embodied cognition is the idea that our body affects our thought, or our body affects our cognition, quote unquote, if you want to use those words, or like the body affects how the brain works. He thinks that embodied cognition relies on a distinction between brain and body. And that distinction doesn't exist in an octopus because they have this distributed system. So that you can't really apply embodied cognition. He did like reference the idea that like they're differently bodied. And I personally, this is my opinion, I think that an octopus is like the quintessential example of embodied cognition, because it is doing sensation, a lot of like a lot of sensation and perception is like happening in the arms, in like the body, quote unquote, like all of like that action shaping thing of like the arms doing their own thing. That is like, I would say that that is like a form of embodied cognition. And then also if you think about like the idea of the like the expression of colors coming from like their internal mental chatter, that's like they are like the colors on their skin are like embodying their cognition, quote unquote. I feel like if you wanted an example of embodied cognition, you would point to the octopus. Like that's what I would say, at least.
Yeah, especially with like the colors. I think with your first example, I feel like Godfrey-Smith would just say, well, actually, I feel like he would just sort of like waive your critique away, even though I think it's fairly legitimate, by just saying that like with the arms, what we're talking about are, you know, the nervous system cells in the arms and the arms themselves. Mm-hmm. And so like, you know, like because you're talking about the nervous system, essentially, what you're not talking about is the body. You're just talking about the nervous system, like you would any other organism. But I do think I'm not sure if that's really like, I'm not sure if that particularly gets at the heart of the issue. Mm-hmm. But of course, I'm also not an expert on body cognition.
Right,
so,
me either.
But I do think that like the idea with like the with the colors, I do think that's like a pretty I'm not sure like how he would be able to effectively respond against that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like at its root, embodied cognition is the idea that like the body affects how thought or cognition works. And I think it makes sense to like have like a disagreement between like normal cognition that happens in the brain and embodied cognition that is influenced by other stuff. It makes sense to have that debate in like the human realm, because we have such a centralized brain compared to the rest of our nervous system. The rest of our like you have the brain, and the central nervous system is like super complex, and the periphery is like not as complex. But like in an octopus, in a cephalopod, it's more distributed, right? So it makes sense that that line gets like blurred a bit